Black Cat. A short story by C.M Reay. 1. Mary hadn't seen the black cat on the road when she drove over it. Bones and fur lifted the hood of her car like a speed bump, a brief and hideous cry, harsh cracking. She took a bin bag from the boot of her car and took off her jacket before bagging the body. Mary recognized it as the cat that had been sitting on her front gate for weeks now, always looking up at her second-story flat, always watching her. It was ridiculous, of course, but it had begun to unnerve Mary, and in a way, she was glad that it was dead. It had become a nuisance after all. More than once since the neighbor downstairs had passed, she caught it trying to sneak inside. Beneath that, however, lay the dread of the old woman. When she got home, Mary put the bagged corpse into her black bin, which sat against the sandblasted exterior of the council house. A long, thin garden, wild and untamed, leading out into darkness, inviting her curiosity, her fear. For a moment, as Mary laid the bag down, inconspicuous now amongst identical trash layered up, she thought she saw it move. A brief jerk, just for a second. That night, Mary struggled to sleep. She prayed, thanking God for all he had done for her, asking for forgiveness, for the curse of the black cat to go unpunished. In the silence of the night, a large twilight moon, Mary felt a deep horror that her pleas would go unanswered. 2. It was raining when she woke up. Mary couldn't remember falling asleep. Then again, she rarely ever could. The onset of the evening had done little to alleviate her concerns about the day's event, and it dragged itself across the sleepless skyline so that she felt each second pass like it was an eternity. Finally, though, it was over, and she rose from bed to the relief of no immediate pains or ailments. Mary walked to the window and opened her blinds to look out across the street. By the looks of things, it had been raining for most of the night, though she was sure she had never heard it. For breakfast, Mary prepared cereal. The milk came out onto the bowl in bits and clumps, and she poured it down the drain and rinsed it quickly. The smell of the off milk lingered, though, and Mary subsided in her appetite, making herself a cup of green tea and sitting in the living room in front of the television. Outside, it was no longer raining, and the sun began to break through the clouds intermittently. Mary still felt quite tired. She had an ache in her neck that was developing quickly. Not that that was unusual. Mary had learned that it was simply one of the side effects of getting older. Everything just hurt a little bit more. Bar the cereal and the stiff neck, her morning went as it always did. She took her morning shower, dried her hair, prepared her face with a light touch of powder and lipstick. In the afternoon, Mary was to have lunch with one of her friends from the island who had ferried over to the mainland to visit. Christmas shopping. And whilst Mary lived too far away to spend the occasion with her son or his children, she made the most of the festive period by lavishing them with gifts through the mail. On Christmas morning, she would eagerly await her son's call and the voices of her little angels on the other line. Safe to say, this trip to the city was one of the highlights of the season. Mary didn't think much about the fact that she didn't go out anymore. She was older, and everything took more time. A shopping trip like today could exhaust her for a fortnight. And then she remembered the car. How it had heaved like a deep breath as it had mounted, crippled, killed the black cat. There were blood on the tires. They had streaked the road. She had been too shaken last night to hose them down. Mary hoped, at least, by now, they would be dry. And then, of course, there was the dead cat in her bin. The night had been playing tricks on her, thwarting Mary at every opportunity as she tried to sleep. First, there was the bedroom door. Despite shutting it firmly, the latch slipped and creaked back and forth against the infiltrating breeze of the cold night air through the hallway windows, whistling between the glass like a boiling tea kettle. And then slam! The door smashed firmly into place. Mary couldn't help but let out a startled yelp. She stopped herself from praying. How ludicrous a thought to bother God at this hour. No, Mary resolved to the conclusion of common sense. Though she could hear no wind now from outside, no rain, the world, though she was too tired to realize it, an utter vacuum. She knew better than to unsettle herself with such thoughts. And yet, later still, somewhere between consciousness and dream, she heard the distant pained cries of an infant child. Short, lazy cries of exhaustion, of extreme pain. But when it screamed, Mary realized it was nothing human. 3. Mary, my darling, how have you been? Melissa held out her hand warmly, and Mary took it, gripping her tightly. She looked amazing, Mary thought. Leaner and outright youthful in her leopard print shirt and black dress, stepping aside as her old friend took the seat by the far wall of their restaurant placing. It was busier than Mary had expected, more youthful. In her cream cardigan she felt like an artifact. Even Melissa at 75 was doing better to blend in than she was. Good, Mary said. I'm doing good. Melissa smiled thinly at her reply and clicked her fingers for a waiter's attention. A young, blond man in a black shirt glanced over from his station at the bar, cleaning glasses, and called on another, younger, blonder boy who took up a menu to approach the table. Melissa looked over at Mary and rolled her eyes, smiling. She had been considering telling Melissa about the incident with the cat, but that feeling was disrupting quickly, now that the pleasantries of their reunion gave way to that familiar, forgotten character that was the real Melissa. 2 martinis, please, darling, she said, smiling. The young waiter nodded, fumbling for his notepad. Make that 1, please, son, said Mary. Melissa raised an eyebrow at her. I'm on a prescription. I can't drink. The young waiter rose one eye from his notepad before catching Melissa's scowl. Mary thought she heard her huff, her friend's posture completely deflating as she slumped into her chair. The young waiter scurried off. You really have gotten old, said Melissa. In her cruel stare, she saw her mother staring back, shrinking and shrinking until she was little more than an insect being loomed over. Her nose crinkled, the lone loose strand of blonde hair. It was her mother. She really was there. Mary held her arms out in front of her, the seams of her polka dot dress stopping shy of her forearms. So small, such soft skin. The firm, hard slap of flesh against her fingers, her mother's outstretched palm colliding harshly with her little growing bones. Dirty little thing, dirty, dirty. They shared their meals between plates, sampling one another's cuisine. Over lunch, Melissa updated her on the lives of her old friends and neighbors, now little more than distant acquaintances, some whose faces had broken free from the names that bound them to meaning. A few had passed away, hardly surprising given their age, yet it still served as a biting reminder of the old clock that loomed over them, that had snuck up on their generation without due notice. An ex-boyfriend of Mary's from her 20s was on Melissa's obituary list, almost buried in with the rest of the faceless, until Mary pulled him out. Louis is dead? She said quietly. Melissa stopped and read her face. She nodded, Then she remembered, and Lewis came alive for both of them one last time. For Mary, it was picking berries along the abandoned train line. The first time they made love, words of eternity shared. For Melissa, it was a single memory, the imprint of a forbidden kiss one night after Mary had gone. A sudden, perfect, irrepressible moment, and then he was dead again, and the two of them spoke of livelier matters. "How is Adrian?" said Melissa. "Is he still working down south?" Mary looked at the table and nodded, a twinge of sadness coursing her features like the impulse of a heartbeat. But Melissa was watching, pulling her handbag up onto the table and ruffling through it. Mary felt a pinch on her skin and glanced up. Both of Melissa's hands were in the bag, pulling out a packet of cigarettes. She felt the pinch again, further up her forearm, and rubbed them down quickly. Melissa drew out her smartphone and unlocked it, paying Mary no mind. The third pinch harder still in the nape of her neck. The sagging jowls of her old skin pulled out and squeezed until it burned like white fire. She couldn't help but let out a grunt, slapping her neck and hitting the bartender's tray instead, approaching from the near end of the bar. Melissa let out a shriek as the glasses clattered and smashed beneath him, the blonde bartender abandoning the tray to grip the wooden panel on the wall, a bed of wet glass inviting his unbalanced form. Mary watched on over her shoulder, frozen, hand over mouth, too slow to react, as the last of his strength gave way. 4. Mary spent the evening wrapping presents, her all-white walls reflecting the faint lamplight under which she worked on the sofa, drawing out the paper, cutting it finely against the frame of the gift, immaculately folding. They had cut their trip short following lunch, the bartender taken to hospital for the extent of his injuries. It was a horrible scene watching the blood mix with martini as he cried out and tried to control his bleeding. And it was all her fault. His suffering was her doing, and Mary prayed for her sins, and began to worry for her soul. First the cat, now this. She was sure she had felt the sharp sting of pinching on her flesh, mumbling between wretched sobs and apologies to the young man who was lying there, and later to anyone that would listen. Yet she never felt it afterwards, the pair making their way half-heartedly up the high street, speaking sparsely, noting the changing hands of old buildings and contemporary fetish for glass. Glass, Mary thought. Blood, Mary thought. At all times in the city she felt there were eyes on her, watching above her every move from a hidden vantage between roofs of greater stone buildings. Always behind her, always now, a shadow. She never mentioned it to Melissa, who had withdrawn entirely from her since the incident in the restaurant. Mary figured that perhaps it was her fault, growing older, clumsier, more embarrassing. But watching her old friend struggle along in the lengths of her stilettos, those cobbled streets stirred in her no jealousy. After Hamley's, a video game department store, and several clothing outlets, the women had retrieved their haul. Unlike in years gone by, they made no effort arranging a follow-up visit. And so Mary went home, the curse of the black cat ever on her lips, wanting desperately to tell someone, to exalt herself of the worry of her heart. When she got home, she saw the lane of black bins along the sidewalk. Her neck was stiff again, the days walking back and forth and in circles around checkouts causing a dull throb in her feet. She walked around to the back of the house where the floodlights clicked on, never touching the far wall of the garden, and looked at the bin, hesitating before pulling it onto its hind legs. When the last of the presents were wrapped, she bundled them neatly on the carpet beside the artificial fireplace. Outside, the new LED lights they had installed the previous summer glared through her open blinds, illuminating the room brighter than it was in day, brighter still than she had ever seen it. so bright that she could hear it, pulsating sonic waves of light. She was squinting now, the reflection against her white walls unbearable. Mary stood up and felt her right ankle crack to the right, letting out an incredible cry, reaching out for the edge of the sofa and falling back onto the bleached leather cushions. Too bright to keep her eyes open, the fabric burning up in the heat. Someone was laughing somewhere, almost inaudibly. A man, but deeper. Mary swallowed her breaths until they were steady, and she stood up again on the weight of her left foot, almost throwing herself towards the window. Outside, the night had settled in calmly, and the street lamps ushered in a faint glow. No foot traffic, no cars. The kind of winter night to watch one's breath in. The only thing that stirred was her bin. It was shaking. Mary watched with her mouth drooped open into unspeakable silence. A powerful force knocking the lid back suddenly, something in the black stirring, leaping to the ground, tearing free, looking up. She could hear it now. The laughing, proper, deep, relentless. The black cat sat watching her, and Mary watched back, fixed in terror as her right arm drew for the blind. But before she could, the cat drew on its paws and ran at pace, down her front garden and out of sight. She managed 2 breaths before she heard the ring of the doorbell. The laughing was gone now, as was the music of the light. Mary left with the tremble of her breaths against her eyes, the dull squeak of the faux wood flooring beneath her feet, the doorbell ringing once more. He is here, Mary thought. The devil has come. 5. Mary sat on the couch and listened as the ringing grew more frequent, more aggressive. They were pounding fists on the door, not one but many, and voices in the walls, voices calling her name, cursing her, voices she recognized, voices she loved, voices that screamed at her in pain and begged for her to stop, and the screeching of the cat in all directions, sometimes by the window, other times in front of her, on the couch where Mary sat. She did not acknowledge it. When it got so that her loved ones came to her, both here and gone, limbless and tortured, she closed her eyes and fixed her mind on the small circle of white in her mind's eye, praying wordlessly, tickling her ears with their whispering, slut, whore, coward, cheater, bastard, murderer, sinner, sinner, sinner. And then it was silence, and later in that silence she opened her eyes. You've been playing, haven't you? Mother was staring at her. She stood in front of the fireplace, wicked, vibrant blonde hair, that familiar loose strand. Mary felt her hands pulled forward, compelled, until they were frozen in midair, the old daughter bewitched like a member of the undead. Hand outright. Mother leaned forward to inspect her nails, the yellow dress she wore fading in color and texture by the second, disintegrating. No, eroding. Bits of dirt clung onto the edges of her dress where they weren't before, worms, holes. It wasn't until she felt her mother's ice-cold fingers upon her own that she remembered it was the dress they had buried her in. Dirty, she said, tutting. Dirty, dirty, dirty. Mary looked up. It wasn't just the dress that was eroding. She caught her breath to scream, but between blinks her mother disappeared. Nothing stirring bar the familiar rhythmic clatter of her windowsill clock and the echo of vehicles on the carriageway. Everything, it appeared, was absolutely normal. When she stood, her right ankle felt fine. The Christmas presents were in their place beside the fireplace. The ringing of the doorbell had stopped. Later in bed, She would lie in wait for the next wave of terrors to befall her. They never came. In the morning, she awoke to another normal day, her morning shower and routine giving way to her walk around the park, the grocery shopping and the pharmacy, before spending the afternoon and evening on the couch as the day's parade of reality shows and game programs warmed her simple heart, drifting between the bathroom and the kitchen, and, eventually, the bed. 6. When the weekend came again, and nothing more had transpired since the incident, Mary concluded that the events of the black cat were over. And rightly so. She prayed to her Lord and asked for forgiveness. Several times she tried to phone her son, but each time met with a dead ring that cut out to voicemail. Later, she understood, it was best not to talk on the matter further. That was that. Mary lived her life. Christmas came and went. Her neck grew stiffer and sorer. She developed bruises down her thighs and on her ankles, swollen lumps on her chest and neck, rashes that teased Mary to scratch at her face and eyes. Doctors diagnosed side effects from her pain medication. They said, "Have you hallucinated, Mary? Have you seen things you can't explain?" And she looked at them, and she shook her head, and she said, "No, doctor, nothing like that." And Mary thought of her mother, of the harsh slaps against her hand, the sight of a bloody rash that, since the incident, had never healed, always seeping through the bandage, always her blood. One day in spring, she left the door open and it entered. She didn't mean for it to happen. Mary had forgotten. Time had passed. Days grew longer now and she slept better. God slipped from her mind more, and the devil also. It entered as black shadow, matted fur, while Mary sat in the garden. She never heard it slink behind her. Mary never heard much now. Her health was failing. In a week, she was to hear back about going to a home. She never knew it had always been watching. Sometimes, it lingered by the doorway and scratched at the frame. Other times, it perched on the front fence. It was smarter now. It had learned. And in the months that passed, it had watched as Mary left her house less and less, until she'd grown complacent, frail. It waited in the bedroom behind the mattress on the far side. Now that it was inside, it saw no need to waste energy existing in another form, shedding the cat and eating its skin, shadows consuming the wall entirely, all of the portraits on all of the walls. Mary awoke in her deck chair on the back lawn just after sunset, orange-pink hue. The garden, her garden, and only hers in the row, consumed by an impossible darkness. But it was late, she thought. She felt it in her bones, and no doubt in her eyes, too. The vision would come back in a moment or two. Mary rose to her feet, slowly. The bones tender these days, feeling every small twinge, every slight provocation. From the upturned flower pot by her side, she retrieved the can of sugar-free lemonade and turned towards the front door. And there was her son, Adrian. What a deep, broad smile on his face. He waved and ushered her over. Mary stared at him in happy bewilderment. Was she dreaming? He looked like a younger version of himself, so fit, so lean. He waved his hands again to usher her over. "What are you doing here?" she said, smiling. "This is a wonderful surprise. Have you brought the boys along?" Adrian, jet blonde hair, just like his grandmother's, didn't reply. He just smiled, wider, and ushered her over once more with his hands. When she still didn't move, He put his fingers to his lips and pointed to the open doorway. "Are they inside?" Mary said. Adrian nodded. Then he stepped inside the doorway and was gone. "Adrian?" she called out. "Adrian?" It was all so sudden. Such an unexpected surprise. Mary walked as quickly as she could to the front door, stepping her foot inside onto the carpet. A shiver ran over her. Suddenly, the whole world was very cold. Mary drew her eyes up the steps of her flat. The lights were dim, as if there were a glaze on her vision. The steps leading up and round and out of sight, each one darker than the one before. She thought about calling out to Adrian. A part of her was frightened somehow, in her own home, as ridiculous as it was. And yet, Mary thought, if she were to call out, she would ruin the surprise. It had been years since she'd seen her grandsons. The last thing she wanted was to ruin that special moment. She closed the front door quietly behind her and slid the latch. There were no shoes by the entryway, she noticed. Her son's standards must have slipped in her absence. No matter, she thought. Nothing a quiet word wouldn't fix. It was so dark inside, even with the lights on. Mary held the banister firmly as she rounded the bend and carried up towards the landing. Darker and darker and darker still. She followed the noise coming from up ahead, muffled behind a closed door. The faint sound of laughter.